I saw the reservation before I saw my husband's face that morning. Owen had left his iPad open beside the espresso machine while rain pressed softly against the windows of our Portland townhouse, and the calendar square glowed like it had been waiting for me. Private tasting for two. It read, and beneath it sat the note that made my fingers go cold. After she signs, we can announce the new direction. For a second, the kitchen felt too clean to be real. With his untouched coffee cooling beside the folded napkins and the oranges I had bought because Owen used to like color in the mornings. He came in buttoning his coat. Neat and expensive in that careful way men get when they are dressing for someone who still admires them. I slid the mug closer, and the wet ring it left on the counter looked louder than my voice. "Are you coming home for dinner?" I kept my eyes on his face while his iPad slept beside my hand. He did not look at the mug, or the screen, or me long enough to notice I had read what he forgot to hide. "Don't wait for me. New client tasting might run late." The answer came too clean, like a door closing before anyone touched the handle. I nodded, because my face had learned calm before my body learned disgust, and he kissed the air near my cheek without landing anywhere real. The front door shut. His car pulled away, and the coffee stayed there beside proof that my marriage had already been negotiated without me. I opened the recent studio charges with hands that looked steadier than they felt. A rented prep kitchen I had never approved. A tasting deposit dressed up as client development. And a table for two at a place Owen once called too intimate for business, all sat there politely. By the time my phone lit up with Callum Price's name, I had screenshots saved and one sentence ready before I could soften it. "I need you to look at something. And I need you to tell me I'm not inventing it." Callum Price was already at the corner table when I walked into the cafe, close enough to the studio to feel dangerous, and far enough from home to breathe. I set my phone between us with the screenshots open, and rainwater slid from my sleeve while he read the reservation, the prep kitchen charge, and the client development note. His face stayed calm until he placed those three things beside the vendor calendar I had forwarded before leaving the house. "Bridget, this is not just him being careless," he said, turning the phone slightly. "This is a pattern." I had expected him to say affair, because that word had already settled inside me before I sat down. Callum did not touch the pain first. He touched the structure around it. The charges Owen had wrapped in business language. The emails where my name had quietly disappeared. The calendar blocks I had never approved. He pointed once to the tasting deposit, then once to the vendor list, and his mouth tightened like the numbers had finally stopped pretending. "He's not leaving messy. He's leaving prepared." That sentence made the room go thin around me, because cheating explained the distance, but preparation explained the way Owen had been slowly removing me from rooms I helped build. I remembered every time he told me not to worry about a vendor call, every time he said I seemed tired and should step back from client-facing work. "I don't even know what still belongs to me," I admitted, keeping my voice low enough that it would not break. Callum slid the phone back gently and answered, "Start with what has your work on it." By the time our coffee went cold, I had stopped shrinking the story so it would hurt less. Callum gave me the name Brielle Dawson, a family law attorney who understood shared brands, small businesses, and men who sounded reasonable before they told the truth. He did not promise I would be fine, which made me trust him more. I left with wet sleeves, saved screenshots, and the first clean shape of a fight I had not known I was allowed to bring. Brielle Dawson's office sat above a rainy street in downtown Portland, plain enough that no one walking past would guess how many marriages had ended honestly inside it. I gave her the screenshots, the shared studio emails, the vendor calendar, and the contracts where my name still appeared before Owen started pretending I had stepped back. She read everything without softening her face, not even when she reached the tasting note that had turned my kitchen silent. "Good," she said, tapping the stack once. "You did not touch anything you had no legal right to access." That sentence steadied me more than comfort would have, because it told me there was still a clean line under my feet. Brielle explained that Oregon cared about what was fair, not just what looked tidy on paper, especially when a shared business had been shaped by one spouse and quietly reframed by the other. She showed me how Owen's story already had a structure. I was tired. I was less involved. I was stepping away. And he was simply keeping the studio alive. I remembered him saying, "Maybe you should rest more," after a client dinner where I had handled every nervous guest and every wrong allergy note. The room felt smaller when I understood that his concern had not been concern at all. It had been preparation in a gentle voice, the kind people believe because it arrives folded like care. Brielle did not let me drift there long, because she had already circled the emails where my name disappeared from client introductions. "Do not confront him yet," she said. "Do not post. Do not threaten. Do not sign anything he hands you." I nodded while the rain dragged thin lines down the window. And for the first time, silence felt like a strategy instead of surrender. Brielle told me to keep originals safe. Build a timeline. Save only what I could lawfully access. And let every emotional sentence Owen sent travel through counsel. Then she looked at the tasting reservation again, the one meant for after I signed myself smaller, and slid it back into the folder. "If he wants a clean ending," she said, "let's make sure it is honest first." The email arrived 3 nights after Brielle told me not to confront him, slipped into a vendor thread Owen had probably meant to control before it reached me. I was standing in the laundry room with one of his shirts, still warm from the dryer, when my phone lit up with a forwarded reply from Delaney Frost. I had known her name in the loose way wives know certain names, from event lists, client dinners, and the careful pause a husband makes before saying them. Then I read her message and understood she had not been waiting outside my marriage. She had been helping Owen draw the exit. Once Bridget is officially stepping back, Owen should be introduced as the full creative lead. Delaney had written, "Neat and confident," as if my life were an update on a website. Below that, she suggested revised bios, a smaller public role for me, and a private reviewer tasting where Owen could reset the studio's identity before anyone asked why I was missing. There was no messy confession, no dramatic love note, nothing I could hate cleanly. It was worse than that, because every sentence had the polished cruelty of a plan trying to pass as branding. Owen had replied, "She won't fight the public side. She hates scenes." I read that line twice, then once more, because it sounded exactly like a man who had studied my restraint and mistaken it for permission. The shirt in my hand slipped against the dryer door, and I remembered every time he had praised me for being reasonable after making me smaller. He had not just counted on my silence. He had built a business strategy around it. I called Brielle from the hallway, keeping my voice low while the house around me stayed as polished and false as ever. "She's not a symptom," I said, with Delaney's email open in front of me. "She's part of it." Brielle did not sound surprised, only precise, and answered, "Then we treat her communications as part of the timeline." I did not reply to the thread, did not text Owen, did not ask Delaney what kind of woman writes another wife out in complete sentences. I saved the email, printed the chain, and placed it in a folder labeled "Proof" I was still there. I signed the lease on the smaller apartment with a pen that felt too light for what it was ending. The place sat near a quiet park where wet maple leaves stuck to the sidewalk, and the windows looked down on ordinary people carrying groceries, not on the kind of kitchen where I had learned to mistake polish for safety. I did not rent it to make a statement, because statements were for people still hoping to be heard by the wrong audience. I rented it because my name was on the paperwork, my key turned in the lock, and nobody else had approved the shape of my next morning. Back at the townhouse, I packed only what was mine and left every shared object exactly where it belonged. My personal records went into one box, my laptop and notebooks into another, and the old concept journals from the studio slid between folders of client thank you notes I had saved without knowing they would someday matter. I took the apron with our studio name stitched across the front, then stopped with it folded against my chest because I could still smell citrus oil, dish soap, and all those late nights after Owen had gone home early to be charming somewhere else. I was not crying over fabric. I was crying because the fabric remembered work he had learned to introduce as his. By noon, the house looked almost unchanged, which made the truth feel stranger. The sofa still faced the bookshelves. The copper pans still hung above the stove. And the coffee mug still sat in the cabinet Owen never opened unless guests were coming. I placed 2 envelopes on the dining table where he would see them before he had time to invent confusion. One held the divorce petition Brielle had filed, and the other held a list of documents his attorney would be asked to produce. With my note folded on top, my attorney has the originals. Do not contact me outside counsel. When Owen called, my phone shook against the counter 4 times before silence returned to the room. I looked at his name and felt the old reflex rise. That trained little urge to manage his shock so he would not have to sit with what he had done. Then I turned the phone face down and picked up the last box. For the first time in years, I did not answer the man who had made me responsible for the comfort of his lies. Owen walked into mediation wearing the calm face I used to mistake for maturity. He had chosen a soft charcoal sweater instead of a suit. The kind of clothing that made him look less like a man who had planned around his wife and more like a husband trying to survive her mood. I sat beside Brielle with my folder closed, because she had told me the quietest person in the room often learns the most. Owen looked at me once, then turned to the mediator and began exactly where Delaney's emails had taught him to begin. Bridget has been overwhelmed for a while, he said, gentle enough to sound responsible if you ignored the documents on the table. She pulled back from client work, and I tried to keep the studio stable. I watched his attorney nod as if grief and bookkeeping had somehow become the same thing. Brielle waited until he finished, then opened my folder and placed the vendor emails, the client notes, and the tasting calendar in a line so plain it felt almost merciless. The first email showed me approving the menu concept Owen claimed I had left behind. The next showed a client thanking me for remembering a guest's allergy after Owen had described me as absent. Then Brielle slid forward the tasting reservation where Delaney had helped him plan a new public version of the studio before I had signed anything. When Owen's attorney called it a misunderstanding in a growing business, Brielle looked at the press list attached to the tasting invite and answered, "Then your client can explain why the misunderstanding had an audience." Owen's calm cracked so slightly that only someone who had slept beside him would have seen it. He leaned toward me and lowered his voice. "Can we just talk privately for 5 minutes?" I felt the old habit rise. The urge to make the room easier for him. But the documents between us had already told the truth better than I ever could. "You had a private life long enough," I said, keeping my hands still. This part stays documented. The fallout did not arrive like a scene, and that almost made it sharper. No one threw a drink. No one raised their voice in a dining room. And no one gave Owen the kind of public injury he could turn into sympathy. It began with an email from Rhonda Bell. Short, polite, and colder than any insult because every word stayed professional. She wrote that her supper club would pause all bookings with the studio until ownership, creative leadership, and client communication were clarified. I read it twice at my small kitchen table, then forwarded it to Brielle without adding a single sentence. Rhonda had not mentioned Delaney, the affair, or the marriage, which made the message impossible to dismiss as gossip. She only referenced the work, the allergy notes I had tracked, the menus I had customized, the calls I had returned after vendor mistakes, the trust Owen had been trying to repackage as his own. A woman like Rhonda did not need a scandal to step back. She needed one clean reason to stop believing the room was safe. After that, the quiet withdrawals started moving through the studio faster than anger ever could. A reviewer Delaney had invited asked why my name was missing from the tasting materials, and an old vendor refused to confirm a date unless I approved the final menu. One client wrote Owen that they had chosen us because I remembered her mother could not eat shellfish, not because of his new direction. Delaney had planned to enter those circles through confidence, but those circles were built on memory, trust, and who answered the phone when something went wrong. Owen texted me that afternoon, and the message landed with the same wounded tone he had used in mediation. "You're damaging something we built." I sent it to Brielle, then sat across from Callum in my new apartment while rain tapped the window like it had been following me from one life to the next. "He keeps saying we built it," I said, looking at the message again, "but he only remembers that word when it costs him." Callum did not smile, and he did not soften it for me, because by then the room outside Owen had already started doing what I never had to ask it to do. The settlement did not make me rich overnight, and that was what made it feel real. It gave me my fair share of the studio's value, protected the concepts I had built, and refused the kind of silence clause Owen wanted because silence had already been too useful to him. He kept part of the business, but not the story he had tried to sell with it. The clients who stayed with him now knew exactly which version of the studio had been edited for their comfort. Delaney left her agency quietly after the same people she had hoped to impress stopped inviting her into private rooms. No one needed to call her anything cruel, because her own emails had already been specific enough. Owen tried to rebuild the brand with cleaner language, softer photos, and fewer references to shared history. But every new introduction carried the weight of what he had removed. I heard about it from people who said it gently, and I learned to let the information pass through me without becoming a place I lived. I signed my new contracts under the name Bridget Pierce, my mother's maiden name, because it sounded like a door opening instead of one closing behind me. Twice a month, I rented a community kitchen and hosted small private tables where guests sat close enough to hear each other laugh. And every menu carried details I remembered, because that had always been my real work. Rhonda Bell booked the first table with one simple message: "We'd like to come back to you." I stared at that sentence longer than I expected, then typed, "Tell them I'm available." That night, my rent was paid. My fridge held the food I actually liked, and no key turned in the lock unless it belonged to me. I stood by the window of my small apartment while the park outside went dark, and the quiet did not feel empty anymore. It felt earned, ordinary, and completely mine. For the first time in years, nobody had to remember my value for it to be true. Thank you for staying with Bridget's story until the end. If her quiet rebuilding felt familiar, share your thoughts below. Sometimes peace starts when the door finally stays locked behind the wrong life. And sometimes being seen again begins with choosing a room that already feels like yours alone again.